Hey guys, tonight we step into a summer morning in Hiroshima, Japan, where the streets are already waking beneath a bright August sky. Bicycles whisper over the pavement, shop doors open one by one, and thousands of ordinary people begin what looks like an ordinary Monday. You can almost feel the warmth settling over the city. It is August 6, 1945. You do not know what is coming. Nobody around you knows what is coming. And that is what makes this morning so unsettling, because history has a strange habit of standing quietly beside you before it changes everything. You walk through Hiroshima as the sun climbs higher. The city sits among rivers and low mountains, its neighborhood spreading across a flat delta. Wooden houses, shops, schools, factories, tram lines, bridges, and military buildings fill the landscape. People hurry to work. Children prepare for school. Shopkeepers arrange their goods. Workers report for another day in the middle of a war that has already lasted for years. You probably won't survive a day in medieval times. But congratulations, because modern history has apparently decided to offer you a completely different survival challenge. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. Maybe you're listening late at night under a blanket. Maybe it's early morning where you are. Or maybe you're doing that classic thing where you promise yourself you'll sleep after just one more history video. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You continue walking. The war is everywhere, even when it is not immediately visible. Japan has been fighting across Asia and the Pacific for years. By 1945, the country is exhausted. Allied forces have pushed steadily closer to the Japanese home islands. Cities across Japan have already experienced devastating conventional bombing, especially the massive firebombing campaign against urban areas. Yet Hiroshima has not suffered the same kind of destruction. That fact matters. The city has become an important military and communications center, but it remains comparatively intact. Its relative preservation is partly connected to its military significance and partly to decisions made by American planners who are considering potential targets for a new weapon. You do not know any of that as you walk. You simply notice that Hiroshima still looks like a functioning city. The rivers reflect the morning light. Bridges connect different parts of the city. Streetcars move along their routes. People carry baskets and bags. Soldiers and workers pass through the streets. Somewhere, a bell may be ringing. Somewhere else, someone is preparing breakfast. The details are small. That is important. History is often remembered through enormous events. But enormous events are experienced by people through tiny details. A cup, a doorway, a bicycle, a school uniform, a conversation that seems completely forgettable. You might pause outside a shop. Someone might be sweeping a sidewalk. A child might be walking beside a parent. A worker might glance upward at the sky without giving it much thought. The morning appears peaceful enough, but the Pacific War has made people accustomed to uncertainty. Air raid warnings are nothing new. Japanese cities have been living with the possibility of bombing. People understand that aircraft can appear overhead. They know what sirens mean. They know where shelters are supposed to be. Still, Hiroshima has not experienced the kind of destruction seen elsewhere. And on this particular morning, there is no overwhelming sense that the city is about to disappear from the face of the earth. In fact, the weather is remarkably favorable. The sky is clear. Visibility is good. For the people making decisions thousands of miles away, those ordinary clouds and patches of blue are suddenly important. The American B-29 bomber Enola Gay is preparing for a mission from Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands. Inside its bomb bay is a weapon unlike anything humanity has used in warfare before. The weapon has a simple name: Little Boy. You don't know its name. You don't know that a specially modified aircraft is carrying it. You don't know that scientists have spent years working on nuclear fission, and that an enormous secret project in the United States has turned that scientific knowledge into a weapon. You don't know that the Manhattan Project has brought together physicists, engineers, military personnel, construction workers, and industrial facilities on a scale rarely seen before. And you certainly don't know that, high above the Pacific, a group of men is flying toward your city. This is where the story becomes almost unbearably strange. The people below are living in ordinary time. The people above are moving through military time. The two worlds are about to meet. Historians still argue whether Hiroshima was selected primarily because of its military importance, its relatively intact condition, its geography, or the desire to demonstrate the new weapon against a significant target. The exact balance of motives remains debated, even though the basic sequence of events is well established. Below, however, there is no historical debate. There is only Monday morning. You keep moving through the streets. Perhaps you notice soldiers. Perhaps you notice school children. Perhaps you hear the rumble of a vehicle. Perhaps you look toward the horizon. The city is busy enough to feel normal, and that normality is what makes the coming moments so difficult to comprehend, because disasters usually announce themselves somehow. A storm darkens the sky, an earthquake begins with a tremor, an approaching army can sometimes be heard. But this morning, Hiroshima is facing something that most people have never imagined, a weapon whose destructive power comes from the splitting of atomic nuclei, a weapon that will transform the meaning of warfare, a weapon that will introduce an entirely new word into the vocabulary of human fear: nuclear. There is also an odd little historical detail hidden inside this terrible morning. Hiroshima had many rivers and waterways because of its location on a delta, and those waterways would later influence both the city's destruction and the movement of survivors. The geography that made Hiroshima a practical and connected city would become part of the story of August 6. For now, though, the rivers simply carry sunlight. The city breathes. People work. People talk. People complain about the heat. People think about lunch. People think about tomorrow. And tomorrow, as it turns out, is already beginning to disappear. You look upward. The sky remains blue. Far away, an aircraft is approaching. And Hiroshima has only a few more minutes of being the city it was when this morning began. You keep walking through Hiroshima, and for a few more minutes, the city feels almost stubbornly ordinary. The summer heat is already building. The streets are active. People are going about the business of getting through another day of war. You pass houses built close together, small shops, schools, government offices, factories, and military facilities. Hiroshima is not simply a place on a map waiting for history to happen to it. It is a living city, filled with people who have routines, worries, friendships, arguments, plans, and absolutely no idea that their city is about to become one of the most famous places on Earth. The war has been going on for years, though, and normal life has become a strange mixture of routine and uncertainty. You have learned that ordinary mornings can include extraordinary precautions. There are air raid drills. There are blackout measures. There are instructions about what to do if enemy aircraft approach. There are emergency preparations and civil defense organizations. You might see people carrying out assigned duties rather than simply wandering through the city. Students are also increasingly drawn into wartime labor because Japan is desperately short of workers and resources. The distinction between school life and wartime life has become increasingly blurred. A teenager who might once have spent the morning studying literature or mathematics may instead be helping with industrial work. Factories need labor. Military production needs labor. Transportation needs labor. The country is mobilizing nearly everything it can, and Hiroshima is an important part of that system. The city serves as a military center and communications hub, with the headquarters of the 2nd General Army located there. Military personnel move through the city, orders pass through offices, supplies move along railways and roads, and information travels through the communications network. That military importance is one reason Hiroshima appears on American target lists. But from street level, Military significance does not necessarily look dramatic. A headquarters building is still just a building. A railway station is still a railway station. A bridge is still a bridge. And a factory is still a place where people spend long hours working. That is one of the unsettling things about cities during wartime. Strategic importance can hide behind completely ordinary architecture. You continue past neighborhoods where homes are packed together, often constructed from wood and other materials that are vulnerable to fire. People have been warned about air raids, but warnings are not the same thing as certainty. And Hiroshima has escaped the kind of large-scale bombing that has devastated many other Japanese cities. That relative lack of destruction becomes significant. American planners want a target that can demonstrate the effect of the new weapon clearly. If a city is already heavily destroyed, it becomes harder to determine exactly what the atomic bomb has done. So Hiroshima remains comparatively intact. To the people living there, that may simply seem like good fortune. To military planners thousands of miles away, it makes the city an attractive target. You don't know that. You just keep walking. Perhaps you notice the summer clothing. Perhaps you hear the sound of footsteps on the street. Perhaps a bicycle passes nearby. There are no dramatic movie strings playing in the background. No mysterious voice announces that history is approaching. There is only the hum of daily life. And somewhere in that daily life, people are trying to preserve tiny pieces of normality. Meals still need to be prepared. Clothes still need to be washed. Work still needs to be completed. Children still need instructions. Letters still need to be written. People still worry about relatives serving elsewhere. Even during war, human beings remain remarkably good at creating routines. You can imagine someone deciding what to eat that morning, someone else wondering whether the weather will stay hot, someone complaining about work, someone thinking about a family member who has not written recently, someone planning to meet a friend later. Those thoughts seem insignificant until you realize how fragile ordinary plans can be. Historians still argue whether the Japanese government understood how close the war was to an unavoidable end by this point. Some leaders recognized that the strategic situation was becoming desperate, while others remained determined to continue fighting, hoping to secure better terms or inflict enough losses to influence the eventual settlement. The average person does not get to participate in those arguments. You simply live inside the consequences. Food is becoming harder to obtain. Fuel is scarce. Industrial production is under enormous pressure. Military defeat is increasingly visible. Yet surrender has not happened. The country remains at war. And because surrender has not happened, people continue preparing for the possibility of invasion. The Japanese government is organizing plans for defending the home islands. Civilians may be expected to contribute. The idea of a final national struggle is present in the atmosphere. That makes the morning of August 6th especially strange. The people of Hiroshima are not living in peacetime. They are living inside a war that seems capable of continuing indefinitely. But they are also living through a morning that appears manageable. There is a curious detail from the period that gives you a glimpse into how deeply wartime instructions entered everyday life. Citizens were encouraged to take part in fire prevention efforts because incendiary bombing was a major concern. Buckets, water supplies, neighborhood organizations, and evacuation procedures became part of the practical vocabulary of survival. You might therefore see people who have rehearsed what to do during an air raid. They have practiced. They have been told how to respond. They think they understand the kind of danger they might face. But what is approaching Hiroshima is not something their drills can truly prepare them for. The difference is not simply scale. It is kind. A conventional bombing raid means aircraft, bombs, noise, and repeated attacks. What is coming will happen in a single blinding instant. The city has no meaningful experience for comparison. You keep moving. The sun rises higher. The air grows warmer. Somewhere beyond the city, the American aircraft continues toward its target. The Enola Gay carries a bomb unlike anything Hiroshima has ever encountered. Its crew has trained for the mission. Its target has been selected. The weather has been observed. The conditions are favorable. Down below, people continue their mourning. This is the strange rhythm of history. One group is preparing to make a decision that will change the world. Another group is simply trying to finish breakfast. And between them is a distance measured in miles, minutes, and an almost impossible difference in understanding. You look around once more. The buildings stand. The streets function. The rivers continue moving through the city. The morning light rests on rooftops. Everything appears solid, permanent almost, but cities only feel permanent because we are usually lucky enough to experience them one ordinary day at a time. Hiroshima is about to lose that luxury. And as the morning advances toward 8:15, the last ordinary minutes are quietly slipping away. The morning of August 6, 1945, continues to unfold with the kind of calm that makes you almost suspicious of it. The sky is clear. The sunlight is bright. The heat is beginning to settle over Hiroshima. You move through the city and notice that people are already deep into their morning routines. Some are heading toward work. Others are carrying out assigned tasks. Students and workers are gathering in different parts of the city. The war is still present in everyone's life, but for the moment, it exists mostly as background pressure. You do not hear the sound of a massive formation of bombers. You do not see hundreds of aircraft filling the sky. You simply see a morning, and somewhere high above you, the mission that will change everything is already underway. The B-29 bomber Enola Gay has taken off from Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands. You cannot see it yet. It is far beyond the horizon, but the aircraft is carrying Little Boy, the atomic bomb designed around uranium-235. The weapon is enormous and complicated, but from your position below, it is simply invisible. That is one of the strangest parts of this morning. The danger is approaching without looking like danger. You continue walking. Maybe you hear aircraft. During wartime, aircraft are not unusual enough to make everyone panic immediately. People have become accustomed to the possibility of planes overhead. And earlier that morning, American aircraft had been detected. There had been warnings, but a small number of aircraft could appear for weather observation or reconnaissance, rather than a large bombing raid. This distinction matters. The American mission involves several B-29s, but Hiroshima is not facing the huge formation people might associate with a conventional bombing attack. So the situation does not immediately trigger the same response as a massive raid. For ordinary people, that means the morning continues. You might look up briefly. You might not. You might hear the distant sound of an engine, and then return to whatever you were doing. That is how quickly normality can become dangerous during wartime. At approximately 8:09 in the morning, the Enola Gay reaches the Hiroshima area. The bombardier Thomas Farabee prepares for the final approach. The target is the A Bridge area, near the center of the city. You are still below. The river continues flowing. Buildings stand in the summer sunlight. People move through the streets, and above them, the aircraft lines up its approach. There is something almost absurd about the precision involved. After years of research, construction, testing, and military planning, the world's first use of an atomic bomb in warfare is now being reduced to a sequence of technical actions. Aircraft speed, altitude, weather, target alignment, timing, release. You do not know any of those numbers. You simply experience the morning. At 8:15 and 17 seconds local time, the bomb is released. The Enola Gay begins moving away. The bomb falls. For a few seconds, Hiroshima remains exactly as it was. Then everything changes. The detonation occurs approximately 600 meters above the city. A brilliant flash appears. The energy released is enormous. The temperature and pressure near the center become unimaginably intense. A massive blast wave expands outward. Buildings are damaged or destroyed across a wide area. Fires begin. The landscape that had looked so stable only moments earlier is suddenly transformed. You do not have time to understand what you are seeing. There is no useful warning. There is no moment when someone can calmly explain the situation. There is simply light, then force, then confusion. The atomic bomb has produced an effect unlike anything Hiroshima has experienced. Historians and scientists have studied the exact physical sequence for decades, calculating blast effects, thermal radiation, altitude, yield, and patterns of destruction. Yet the scientific measurements can never fully capture what it means to experience the event as an ordinary person standing in the city. Numbers can describe energy. They cannot describe disbelief. The explosion produces a tremendous flash that is visible across the city. People who survive the first instant may find themselves thrown down or surrounded by debris. Windows shatter, walls collapse, roofs are damaged. Objects become dangerous projectiles. The familiar geometry of streets and buildings becomes difficult to recognize. You might have been standing beside a house a moment earlier. Now you are surrounded by fragments and dust. You might have known exactly where you were. Now you are trying to understand where anything is. The city does not simply become damaged. It becomes unfamiliar. And that is perhaps one of the most psychologically important details. Imagine knowing your neighborhood so well that you can walk home without thinking. Now imagine looking around and realizing that landmarks have disappeared. The places that helped you orient yourself are suddenly gone. The bomb has also produced intense heat. Fires begin in many locations. Wooden structures ignite. Smoke rises. The clear summer morning is replaced by a chaotic atmosphere of dust, smoke, heat, and confusion. The people who are still conscious have almost no way of understanding the scale of what has happened. Some may assume a conventional bomb has struck. Others may think a huge ammunition store has exploded. The concept of an atomic bomb is still unfamiliar to almost everyone. The world has entered the nuclear age, but the people underneath that first explosion do not know it yet. There is a peculiar detail that sometimes gets overlooked when people discuss Hiroshima. The bomb was not detonated at ground level. It exploded in the air, deliberately chosen to maximize the area affected by the blast and heat. The altitude was part of the weapon's design and the military planning behind the mission. You stand if you are fortunate enough to remain standing, or perhaps you struggle to move. The streets no longer look like streets. The morning routine has vanished. There is no clear boundary between before and after. There is only the moment when Hiroshima was one city, and the moment immediately afterward when it became something else. Historians still argue over many aspects of the decision that led to this morning. But there is no debate about the basic fact that August 6 marked a fundamental turning point in warfare. The first atomic bomb used in combat has exploded over a populated city. The consequences are only beginning. And now, beneath the strange brightness of the ruined morning, you have to move forward without knowing what has happened, where your family is, where help might be, or whether another attack is coming. The sky is still above you, but it no longer feels like the same sky. The sky above Hiroshima has changed, but the strangest part is that the morning itself has not stopped. The sun is still there. The rivers are still flowing. The mountains still surround the city, but everything between them has been transformed. You are trying to understand what just happened, and your mind keeps reaching for an explanation that makes sense. Maybe it was a huge conventional bomb. Maybe an ammunition depot exploded. Maybe several bombs arrived together. There has to be an ordinary explanation. Except there isn't. At 8:15 in the morning, the atomic bomb has detonated approximately 600 meters above the city. The first thing you experience is light. Not ordinary sunlight. Not the brief flash of an aircraft. A sudden, extraordinary brightness that overwhelms the morning. Then comes the heat. Then the blast. The sequence is so fast that your ability to process it falls far behind the physical event itself. You may find yourself thrown down. Buildings around you have been damaged or destroyed. Glass has shattered. Wooden structures have collapsed. Dust fills the air. For a moment, the world becomes almost impossible to interpret. You look towards something that used to be familiar, but it no longer looks familiar. A street is buried beneath debris. A building has partially collapsed. A wall that was there a moment ago is gone. The city has lost its visual language. And then slowly, you begin to hear. The first moments after the blast are filled with confusion. People call out. Others try to move. Some are searching for relatives. Some are trying to get outside. Some simply remain where they are, stunned by what they have witnessed. There is no organized explanation waiting for you. No loudspeaker immediately announces what happened. No official calmly tells everyone that an entirely new type of weapon has been used. The people of Hiroshima have to discover the disaster while standing inside it. This is one of the central difficulties of understanding historical catastrophes. We know what happened because we are looking backward. You do not have that advantage. You are inside the moment. You do not know the name of the weapon. You do not know its explosive yield. You do not know that scientists in the United States have spent years building it. You do not know that the bomb has released energy through nuclear fission. You do not know that this single event will help define the geopolitical history of the second half of the 20th century. You only know that something enormous has happened, and you are trying to find your way through it. The blast has traveled outward from the detonation point at tremendous speed. The pressure wave damages structures across a broad area. Hiroshima's wooden buildings are especially vulnerable. Some collapse, others are severely damaged. Fires spread through neighborhoods where structures are close together. The city's infrastructure is overwhelmed. Roads become difficult to use. Communication systems are disrupted. Transportation is affected. The familiar systems that normally make a city function suddenly stop functioning properly. This is why the destruction feels larger than a single explosion. A city depends on thousands of interconnected systems. Water, transportation, communication, electricity, medical care, food distribution, emergency response. When enough of those systems fail simultaneously, ordinary life becomes almost impossible. You look for help, but the people who might normally provide that help are themselves caught in the disaster. Doctors are injured. Hospitals are damaged. Nurses and medical workers are among those affected. Even people who survive relatively close to the center may find that the institutions they expect to rely upon are no longer functioning normally. The result is a terrible kind of isolation. You are surrounded by people, but everyone is struggling to understand what has happened. A strange historical detail emerges from later accounts. People who were some distance from the center sometimes reported seeing the flash through windows or experiencing unusual sensations before the blast reached them. The event was so intense that memories of the light, sound, heat, and sudden pressure remained vivid decades later. And this is where memory becomes important. The event itself lasts only moments. The memories can last a lifetime. You move through the city, or try to. The morning heat has become oppressive. Smoke rises. The sky is obscured in places. The atmosphere is filled with dust and debris. There are fires burning across different parts of Hiroshima. You may see people moving away from damaged areas. Others move toward them, searching for family members. Nobody has a reliable map of the new Hiroshima. The city has become a landscape of uncertainty. Historians still argue about how best to interpret the immediate psychological experience of survivors, because no single account can represent everyone. People respond differently to catastrophe. Some immediately search for relatives. Others seek water. Others help strangers. Some become disoriented or simply sit still. There is no correct reaction. There is only survival. And survival now depends on basic things. Finding shelter, finding water, avoiding fires, finding people you know, getting away from unstable buildings, understanding which places are still safe enough to enter. The irony is that many of the things that usually make a city comfortable are now sources of danger. A damaged building may collapse. A familiar road may be blocked. A river may seem like a place of refuge, while the surrounding area remains chaotic. A home that once meant safety may no longer provide it. You continue moving. Somewhere, people are beginning to realize that this was not an ordinary bombing raid. The scale is too strange. The destruction is too concentrated. The flash was too intense. The blast was too powerful. But even then, the truth remains difficult to imagine. The atomic bomb has introduced a new category of destruction, and Hiroshima is the first city to experience it. By the end of the day, enormous numbers of people will have been killed or injured, and the physical destruction will stretch across much of the city. But right now, you are still in the first hours. The full consequences have not yet revealed themselves. You are standing inside the first chapter of the nuclear age, without knowing that you are standing there. The city around you is burning. The people around you are searching. The sky above you is filled with smoke. And somewhere beneath all that confusion is one simple human need. You need to know where the people you love are. You begin to move through Hiroshima without really knowing where you are going. The streets you knew this morning are difficult to recognize now. Buildings have collapsed, roads are blocked, smoke hangs in the air, and the familiar sounds of the city have been replaced by confusion. You are looking for people. That becomes the first priority. A parent searches for a child searches for a parent, friends look for friends, neighbors call out names, workers try to find colleagues. The disaster has turned the entire city into a search for someone. And the strangest thing is that you still don't fully understand the scale of what has happened. You know something enormous has exploded. You know the destruction is extraordinary. But the idea that a single bomb has done this is almost impossible to comprehend. The people around you have no useful reference point. They have experienced air raids before. They know what bombs can do. But this is different. The destruction is widespread. The blast has traveled far, and fires are appearing across the city. Hiroshima's location on a flat river delta contributes to the way the blast and fires move through densely built neighborhoods. Wooden homes and other structures are particularly vulnerable to fire, and many areas become extremely difficult to navigate. You step carefully. The ground is covered with debris. A road that should be open is blocked. A building that once provided shade is no longer standing. Smoke reduces visibility. The heat of the August morning is now mixed with the heat produced by the fires. And there is another problem. Water. After a disaster, water becomes one of the first necessities. People are thirsty. People are searching for drinking water. Some move toward rivers or other water sources. Others look for wells, tanks, or whatever supplies remain available. This creates another strange contrast. Hiroshima is a city surrounded and divided by waterways. Yet clean drinking water is suddenly difficult to obtain. You might think that surviving the blast is the hardest part, but survival is only beginning. Medical care is desperately limited. Hospitals and clinics have been damaged. Medical workers themselves may be injured. Supplies are scattered or inaccessible. There are too many people who need help, and too few people able to provide it. Doctors and nurses, who are still able to work, begin treating people wherever they can. Schools, temples, open areas, and other surviving structures can become improvised places of assistance. The usual boundaries of medical care disappear. There is no comfortable waiting room, no orderly line, no receptionist telling you which room to enter. The city has become an emergency ward, and you are walking through it. People try to help one another. This is one of the most important parts of the story, because the destruction does not erase human cooperation. Quite the opposite. In the middle of enormous confusion, survivors carry water, help injured strangers, guide people away from damaged buildings, search for relatives, and try to make sense of what has happened. Not everyone can help. Not everyone is able to move. But acts of assistance appear everywhere. There is no single heroic moment. There are thousands of small ones. Someone gives another person water. Someone helps a stranger walk. Someone searches through debris. Someone points toward a safer route. Someone shares information. These small actions become the fragile structure holding people together. Historians still argue about how much of Hiroshima's emergency response can be understood as organized civil defense, and how much emerged spontaneously from individuals and communities. The answer is probably complicated, because both systems and ordinary people played roles, while the scale of destruction overwhelmed nearly everything. You continue forward. The city is becoming quieter in some places, and more chaotic in others. There are fires, smoke, dust, people moving in groups, people standing alone. The psychological shock is enormous. Imagine waking up in a familiar city and discovering that the landmarks you have known your entire life have vanished within seconds. You might recognize a bridge, but not the streets around it. You might know that your school should be nearby, yet find it difficult to locate. You might walk toward your neighborhood, only to discover that the landscape has changed completely. This creates an unsettling problem. Where do you go when the city itself can no longer tell you where you are? You rely on memory. You rely on rivers. You rely on surviving buildings. You rely on other people. And sometimes you simply walk. One of the more unusual details from survivor accounts is how many people describe the morning in terms of the sky and light. Even decades later, memories of the strange brightness remain remarkably powerful. For many survivors, the flash became one of the defining images of the event. The physical destruction is overwhelming, but the emotional uncertainty may be just as difficult. You do not know whether another bomb is coming. You do not know whether the American aircraft will return. You do not know whether the city will be attacked again. You do not know whether your family members are alive. You do not know what happened to people who were somewhere else when the explosion occurred. And you do not know what caused the strange injuries and illnesses appearing among survivors. That last question will become increasingly important, because the bomb has done something people cannot see. The explosion has released radiation. For those close to the center, the immediate effects are dominated by blast and heat. But radiation exposure will become another part of Hiroshima's story. At this moment, however, people have little understanding of what radiation means. They are dealing with what is directly in front of them: a collapsed wall, a fire, a missing relative, a thirsty child, a damaged road, a place to rest. You continue through the afternoon. The sun remains high. The smoke changes the light. Hiroshima is no longer the city you entered this morning. And yet beneath the destruction, life continues. Someone is still calling a name. Someone is still carrying water. Someone is still searching. Someone is still hopping. That may be the most human detail of all. Even when the world seems to have ended, people continue looking for one another. By evening, the full scale of the disaster is still difficult to measure. There are no instant statistics, no reliable list of the dead, no complete map of destruction, no clear explanation, only fragments, stories, rumors, memories, and thousands of people trying to survive the first night. You find somewhere to rest if you can. The city around you is darkening. The fires glow in the distance. The air is heavy. The day that began with ordinary routines has become something nobody could have imagined. And while you try to sleep, Hiroshima has entered a new and frightening phase. The morning brought the bomb. The night brings the questions. Night settles over Hiroshima, but darkness does not bring much rest. You are surrounded by a city that no longer looks familiar. Fires still glow in different parts of the landscape. Smoke drifts through the air, and people continue moving between damaged neighborhoods, searching for relatives, water, shelter, or some place where they can simply sit down. You have survived the morning, but surviving the morning does not mean you understand what happened. And now another strange part of the story begins. The sky changes. A dark cloud hangs over the city, and rain begins to fall in some areas. People are thirsty. They have been walking through heat, dust, smoke, and destruction for hours. So when rain arrives, water naturally seems like something to welcome. You might stretch out your hands. You might try to drink it. You might think it is simply summer rain. But this rain is different. It becomes known as the Black Rain. The name sounds almost unreal, like something invented for a nightmare. Yet it is one of the most remembered features of the Hiroshima aftermath. The rain is darkened by soot, ash, dust, and other material drawn upward by the explosion and fires. The enormous blast has pushed debris and smoke high into the atmosphere. As the cloud changes and moisture condenses, dark precipitation falls over parts of the city and surrounding areas. To someone standing beneath it, there is no obvious reason to think of radiation. You see rain, you feel water, you may be desperate for it. You do not have the scientific information needed to understand what might be carried within that strange weather. This is one of the cruelest features of invisible hazards. You cannot look at them. You cannot smell them reliably. You cannot simply step back because the danger is glowing or making a noise. Radiation does not announce itself in the way fire does. Fire tells you to move away. Smoke tells you something is burning. Radiation can be present without giving you an obvious sensory warning. The Black Rain, therefore, becomes part of a much larger story about what Hiroshima teaches the world. The danger does not necessarily end when the explosion ends. You might assume that the worst moment is over. The bomb has exploded. The blast is past. The fires are gradually changing. The sky is dark. Surely the danger must be decreasing. In some ways, yes, but the consequences are continuing. The scientific understanding of radiation is still developing. Although nuclear physics has already advanced rapidly during the war, scientists involved in the Manhattan Project understand that the atomic bomb produces radiation. The people of Hiroshima, however, do not have access to that knowledge in the middle of the disaster. They are not walking around with instruments that can measure invisible particles. They are simply trying to live, and that means decisions are being made without information. You continue through the damaged city. The Black Rain does not fall equally everywhere. Historical research has produced different estimates and maps of its distribution, and scholars have debated exactly how far it traveled and how much radioactive material different areas received. Historians still argue about aspects of the Black Rain's geographic pattern because eyewitness accounts, weather conditions, physical evidence, and later scientific studies do not always produce a perfectly simple picture. That uncertainty is important. History is not always a clean line of numbers. Sometimes it is a collection of memories that overlap imperfectly. A survivor may remember rain falling in one place. Another remembers it somewhere else. A scientific reconstruction may suggest a broader or different pattern. All of those pieces become part of the attempt to understand the event. You might sit beneath some surviving shelter while rain falls outside. The sound is strangely ordinary. Raindrops, wind, water hitting damaged roofs. For a few moments, it could almost feel peaceful. And that is precisely what makes the scene so unsettling. The world is trying to behave normally. Rain still falls. Night still comes. People still become tired. But Hiroshima is no longer normal. The Black Rain becomes one of the symbols of that contradiction. Water, usually associated with relief, becomes connected to uncertainty. The atmosphere itself seems to have changed. You may hear people talking about strange things they have seen. Rumors spread quickly. Someone says another attack is coming. Someone else says the entire city has been destroyed. Someone claims that help is arriving. Another person says there is no help. In a disaster, information becomes almost as valuable as food. And accurate information is difficult to find. Communication systems have been heavily disrupted. Government offices have been damaged. Telephone lines and transportation networks have been affected. Reports reaching other parts of Japan are incomplete and confusing. The central government does not immediately possess a full picture of what has happened. That delay matters because Hiroshima is not just experiencing a local catastrophe. It is becoming the center of an event that the Japanese government itself is struggling to understand. Meanwhile, you are still concerned with much smaller questions. Where can you sleep? Where is your family? Can you find water? Is the building beside you safe? Will the rain continue? Should you move somewhere else? These are the questions that fill the hours. The atomic bomb has changed global history, but the people inside the city are not thinking about global history. They are thinking about tomorrow morning. If they can reach tomorrow morning. A curious detail from later research is that the black rain became a subject of intense scientific and political interest for decades. Scientists studied soil, trees, roof tiles, clothing, and survivor testimony to reconstruct where radioactive fallout may have traveled. Hiroshima therefore became not only a human tragedy, but also one of the most studied environments in the early nuclear age. You remain beneath the dark sky. The rain begins to weaken. Smoke still hangs over parts of the city. The fires continue to glow. People settle wherever they can. Some sleep, some cannot. Some continue searching through the night. And somewhere beyond Hiroshima, officials and military leaders are beginning to receive reports that something extraordinary has happened. The news is incomplete. The explanation is uncertain. But soon, the rest of Japan, and eventually the entire world, will learn that Hiroshima has been struck by a weapon unlike any previously used in war. For now, though, you are still inside the city. The rain has stopped. The streets are dark, and the invisible consequences of the morning are only beginning to reveal themselves. Morning returns to Hiroshima, but it does not feel like a new day. You wake in a city that has been changed beyond recognition, and for a moment, you may not even remember where you are. Then the memories return. The flash, the blast, the heat, the smoke, the strange darkness, and now the search. You begin looking for someone. That is what thousands of people are doing around you. They are not thinking about military strategy or international politics. They are thinking about names. A mother is looking for her child. A brother is looking for his sister. A husband is trying to find his wife. A student is looking for classmates. A worker is searching for coworkers who disappeared when buildings collapsed. The city has become a collection of personal searches, and every search begins with the same fragile hope. Maybe they are alive. You move slowly through the streets. The places that once helped you navigate are damaged or gone. Roads are blocked by debris. Buildings that once stood as landmarks have disappeared. Fires have altered entire neighborhoods. You have to depend on memory. You remember where a bridge should be. You remember the direction of a school. You remember a particular shop. You remember a house. But when you reach the location, the landscape may no longer match the picture inside your head. This is one of the most disorienting consequences of large-scale destruction. Your memory tells you where something should be. Your eyes tell you it is gone. You keep walking. People are gathering wherever they believe relatives might have gone. Schools become places where information is exchanged. Temples and public buildings become temporary gathering points. Railway areas become important because people hope transportation will help them leave the city or reach relatives elsewhere. But transportation has been badly disrupted. The normal movement of a city has broken down. You might encounter someone who has heard a rumor about a particular neighborhood. Someone says a certain hospital is still operating. Another person says a relative was seen near a bridge. Someone else believes their family went toward the countryside. None of the information is guaranteed, yet you follow whatever leads you can find. This is how disasters create a strange economy of rumors. Information has become valuable, but nobody knows how much of it is true. You keep searching. Sometimes the search ends with relief. Sometimes it ends with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be harder to carry than a definite answer. You might find a relative alive, but unable to return home. You might find a friend injured. You might find a familiar person who has survived, but cannot explain what happened to everyone else. Or you might find nothing. No message, no clear answer, just silence. The scale of Hiroshima makes individual searches especially difficult. Tens of thousands of people are dead or missing, and countless others have been injured or displaced. The city is not equipped to create a complete record immediately. There are too many people, too much destruction, Too little functioning infrastructure. Even identifying the dead can become extremely difficult. Names disappear into incomplete records. Families are separated. People who leave the city may never know exactly what happened to someone who was there. And this is one reason Hiroshima's human story cannot be reduced to a single number. Numbers are necessary. They help historians understand scale. But a number does not tell you that one particular person was supposed to meet someone for lunch. A number does not tell you that a child had a favorite teacher. A number does not tell you that someone had planned to return home after work. Every person represented in a statistic had a life that existed before the explosion. Historians still argue over the exact number of deaths attributable to the bombing and its immediate and later effects. Partly because records were destroyed, people died over different periods, and definitions of atomic bomb deaths can vary. The uncertainty does not make the loss smaller. If anything, it reminds you how difficult it is to measure a catastrophe when the catastrophe itself has destroyed the paperwork needed to count it. You continue through the city. The search also reveals another side of Hiroshima. People begin helping one another organize. Survivors share food and water. Those who are physically able assist people who cannot walk. Some medical workers continue treating patients despite the destruction around them. Others gather information. Some attempt to contact government offices. Some try to leave the city. Others refuse to leave because they are still searching for relatives. The city is broken, but human cooperation continues. That may be easy to overlook when you focus only on the destruction, but survival is rarely an individual achievement. It is usually collective. Someone carries water. Someone provides directions. Someone gives shelter. Someone shares a piece of food. Someone tells you that your relative was seen at a particular location. Small acts become enormous when everything else has disappeared. You keep searching. Perhaps you eventually reach a familiar area. The memory is stronger than the landscape. You remember how it looked before. The street had houses. There was a shop at the corner. A tree stood beside a wall. Children used to pass through here. Now the same location seems almost empty. This is where memory begins to compete with physical reality. You can still picture Hiroshima as it was. Your mind supplies the missing buildings. For a moment, you can almost see the old city. Then you look again. The buildings are gone. The silence feels different. One of the most haunting features of survivor testimony is precisely this comparison between remembered Hiroshima and destroyed Hiroshima. People often carry detailed memories of neighborhoods that no longer existed, preserving a mental map that could not be rebuilt simply by looking at the landscape. You continue. The search may take hours, maybe days. For some families, it will take much longer. And while you search, another transformation is taking place beyond the ruined streets. The Japanese government is beginning to understand that Hiroshima has suffered an unprecedented attack. American officials are preparing to announce the existence of the atomic bomb. The world is about to learn what you still do not fully understand. But inside Hiroshima, history remains personal. You are still looking for someone. You still have a name in your mind. You still hope to hear an answer. The war may be approaching its final days. The nuclear age may be beginning. But for you, none of that matters yet. You keep walking through the ruins, calling out, listening, waiting. And somewhere between the broken streets and the quiet rivers, you begin to realize that finding the missing will not simply mean finding people. It will mean trying to recover a piece of the life that existed before the flash. You are still in Hiroshima, still moving through the damaged streets, but beyond the city, the story is beginning to change. The news is traveling. At first, it travels slowly and uncertainly. Reports reach Japanese authorities describing enormous destruction, widespread fires, and a city that appears to have suffered something far beyond a conventional air raid. But information is incomplete. Communication networks have been damaged. Rail lines and roads are disrupted. People who might normally send reports are themselves missing or injured. So the first descriptions arriving from Hiroshima sound almost unbelievable. A city has been devastated. But by what? You can imagine officials sitting in offices elsewhere in Japan, trying to understand the reports. A single bomb. That seems impossible. A conventional bombing raid. Perhaps, but the destruction does not fit comfortably into the familiar categories of wartime attacks. And while Japanese authorities are trying to understand Hiroshima, the United States is preparing to tell the world exactly what has happened. The American government has something the people of Hiroshima do not. An explanation. On August 6, President Harry Truman announces that the United States has used a new atomic weapon against Hiroshima. For the first time, much of the world learns that an entirely new kind of bomb has been used in warfare. The announcement is carefully framed as a military achievement. Truman describes the weapon as extraordinarily powerful and warns Japan that further destruction may follow if it does not surrender. You are still in Hiroshima. You have no radio broadcast that can explain everything. You are simply living inside the announcement's consequences. The world is learning about the bomb, while you are learning what the bomb has done. That difference is enormous. For people far away, Hiroshima initially becomes a headline. For survivors, it remains a collection of streets, buildings, faces, voices, and missing names. The American announcement also reveals something else. The weapon was not an accident. It was the result of a vast scientific and industrial program. During the war, the United States had created the Manhattan Project, bringing together scientists, engineers, military officials, construction workers, and industrial facilities in an enormous secret effort. Researchers had been studying nuclear fission, the process in which the nucleus of an atom can split and release tremendous energy. The project ultimately produced workable nuclear weapons. Hiroshima became the first city against which such a weapon was used. The scale of the scientific effort is difficult to imagine. You might picture a laboratory with a few brilliant scientists working over complicated equipment. But the Manhattan Project is much larger than that. It involves multiple major sites, enormous industrial operations, laboratories, military organizations, and thousands upon thousands of workers. Most of those people do not know the entire purpose of what they are helping build. Some workers understand only their small part. Others know that something related to nuclear research is happening. A much smaller group understands the weapon's ultimate purpose. The secrecy is extraordinary. And now, after Hiroshima, that secret has become public. The world has entered the atomic age. You continue walking through Hiroshima. Perhaps you hear someone discussing the radio announcement. Maybe you hear that the Americans have used an atomic bomb. The phrase itself sounds strange. It does not immediately tell you what the weapon means. An ordinary person hearing the words might struggle to understand how an atomic process could destroy an entire city. Scientists understand the principle. Military planners understand the destructive potential. But ordinary language has not yet caught up with the technology. That is one of the recurring patterns of modern history. Human beings create something before they develop the vocabulary to emotionally understand it. The airplane changes warfare. The radio changes communication. The automobile changes cities. And now the atomic bomb changes the meaning of destruction. Historians still argue about how much Truman and his advisors understood about the bomb's long-term consequences, especially regarding radiation and the future of nuclear warfare. The decision was made within the context of a brutal global war, but the consequences quickly extended beyond that immediate conflict. You can already see one consequence: fear. If one bomb can destroy a city, what happens when countries possess hundreds? That question does not yet have an answer, but it will become one of the defining questions of the 20th century. For now, the United States is demanding Japan's surrender. Japan's leaders are facing a crisis. The military situation is already desperate. Cities have been bombed. The Navy has been devastated. Resources are running short. The possibility of invasion hangs over the country. And now Hiroshima has been destroyed by a weapon whose power is difficult to comprehend. Yet the Japanese government does not immediately surrender. This is important. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima does not automatically end the war. Political leaders debate what the attack means. Some may wonder whether the Americans possess more atomic bombs. Others question whether the weapon can really be as powerful as claimed. The military leadership remains deeply concerned about surrender and the possibility of an Allied invasion. You are still searching for your own people. The national debate feels distant, but it is happening above and beyond you. And soon another event will make the situation even more complicated. The Soviet Union is preparing to enter the war against Japan. For months, the Soviet Union has been bound by a neutrality agreement with Japan, but that agreement is about to end. On August 8, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. Soviet forces then launch an invasion of Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. This changes the strategic situation dramatically. Now Japan is facing pressure from both directions. The United States has demonstrated a terrifying new weapon. The Soviet Union has entered the war. The Japanese leadership has to decide what these developments mean. And historians still debate how much each factor contributed to Japan's eventual decision to surrender. Some emphasize Hiroshima. Some emphasize the Soviet declaration of war. Others argue that the combination of military pressure, political divisions, the threat of further atomic attacks, and the increasingly hopeless strategic situation mattered most. There is no simple, single-key explanation. History rarely behaves that neatly. You return to Hiroshima. The city remains devastated. The announcement from Washington has not rebuilt a single house. It has not restored a single bridge. It has not answered the thousands of personal questions still hanging in the air. But something has changed. The destruction of Hiroshima is no longer only a local event. It has become an international event. People across the world now know that an atomic bomb exists. Governments begin thinking about nuclear weapons. Scientists begin considering what they have helped create. Military planners begin imagining future wars. And ordinary people begin wondering whether cities everywhere could someday experience what Hiroshima has experienced. You look across the ruined landscape. The rivers continue moving quietly. The sun rises and sets. People continue searching. And above the physical destruction, another kind of history is beginning. The age of nuclear fear has arrived. Hiroshima is no longer simply a city caught in the final weeks of the Second World War. It has become the first unmistakable warning of what modern science can place in human hands. And the world has barely had time to understand the first bomb before another one is already waiting. You have barely begun to understand Hiroshima when the war moves again. The first atomic bomb has already changed the world, but it has not yet ended the war. 3 days have passed since the destruction of Hiroshima. It is August 9, 1945, and while you are still imagining the ruined streets of Hiroshima, another American B-29 bomber is preparing for a mission. Its destination is not Hiroshima. This time, the primary target is Kokura. Inside the aircraft is another atomic bomb. Its name is Fat Man. Unlike Little Boy, which used a uranium-based design, Fat Man uses plutonium. The technical details are complicated, but the basic idea is simple enough. Another nuclear weapon is ready to be used. You might imagine that after Hiroshima, the world would pause. Perhaps everyone would stop. Perhaps the destruction would be so shocking that another attack would immediately become unthinkable. But war does not always pause simply because human beings are horrified. The mission continues. The B-29 boxcar takes off from Tinian carrying Fat Man. The crew heads toward Kokura. The weather becomes important, very important. The bomb requires a visual target. Clouds and poor visibility can interfere with the mission. As the aircraft approaches Kokura, the weather does not cooperate. Cloud cover makes the target difficult to see. You can almost imagine the strange tension inside the aircraft. The weapon is ready. The mission is underway. But the target is hidden. Fuel is also becoming a concern. The aircraft cannot simply circle indefinitely, so the crew moves toward the secondary target. Nagasaki. Nagasaki is a major industrial and port city in western Japan. It contains shipyards, factories, and military-related industries, but it is also a city filled with ordinary people. Families live there. Children attend schools. Workers report to factories. Religious communities have existed there for generations. And now, without knowing it, Nagasaki is becoming the destination of the second atomic bombing. The aircraft approaches. Visibility improves enough for the crew to identify the target area. At approximately 11:02 in the morning, the bomb is released. Fat Man detonates above Nagasaki. Once again, an enormous flash appears. Once again, a blast expands across a populated city. Once again, buildings are damaged or destroyed. Once again, people who are nowhere near military decisions suddenly find themselves inside history. The geography of Nagasaki is different from Hiroshima. Hills surround much of the city, and those hills affect the distribution of the blast. The destruction is nevertheless catastrophic. Fires begin. Communications are disrupted. People are injured and killed. The city is thrown into confusion. And once again, the people experiencing the explosion do not understand the full nature of the weapon. They know something enormous has happened. They do not necessarily know why. They do not know that only 3 days earlier another city suffered a similar attack. They do not know whether another bomb exists. They do not know whether more attacks are coming. The uncertainty is enormous. One of the strange historical details surrounding Nagasaki is that the city was not originally the primary target that morning. The mission had been directed toward Kokura, but weather conditions pushed the aircraft toward the secondary target. This means the fate of Nagasaki was influenced not only by strategic planning, but also by clouds, visibility, fuel, timing, and decisions made during the flight. History sometimes turns on enormous political choices. Sometimes it also turns on weather. You remain in the broader story, watching the war tighten around Japan. Hiroshima has already been devastated. Nagasaki has now suffered the second atomic attack. The Soviet Union has entered the war against Japan. The Japanese leadership faces a rapidly changing strategic situation. There is little time left, but surrender is not yet automatic. Inside Japan's leadership, disagreement remains. Some officials believe the situation has become impossible to continue. Others remain determined to seek conditions that would preserve important aspects of Japan's existing political order. The emperor's position becomes increasingly important. The question is no longer simply whether Japan can continue fighting indefinitely. It is whether the government can find a way to end the war without complete national collapse. And the atomic bombings create a new problem. If the United States can destroy a city with one weapon, how many more weapons does it possess? That question becomes central. The Japanese leadership cannot know the exact American stockpile. Neither can the public. The uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. You can imagine the psychological effect. Hiroshima is gone. Now Nagasaki has been struck. The Soviet Union is advancing. The possibility of invasion remains. The country is surrounded by evidence that the war is no longer sustainable in the old sense. Historians still argue about the relative importance of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet entry into the war. Some historians emphasize the shock of the atomic bombings. Others argue that the Soviet declaration of war was especially decisive because it destroyed hopes that Moscow might mediate between Japan and the Allies. There is also debate over whether the second atomic bombing was necessary once Hiroshima had occurred. That question has remained controversial for decades. Supporters of the decision have argued that continued fighting could have caused enormous casualties during a conventional invasion, and that Japan's leadership had not surrendered after Hiroshima. Critics argue that alternatives may have existed, and that the second bombing came before Japan had enough time to fully respond to the first. The debate continues chose because the decision involved military calculations, political goals, intelligence assessments, moral questions, and assumptions about what might happen next. There is no simple answer that makes every part of the historical record disappear. Meanwhile, ordinary people in both cities are left with the consequences. In Hiroshima, survivors continue searching. In Nagasaki, survivors are beginning the same process. People look for relatives. People seek water. People try to understand what happened. And in both cities, the immediate destruction is only the beginning. Radiation exposure will affect survivors in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Some people who appear relatively well at first will later become seriously ill. The bomb therefore creates a timeline that does not end with the explosion. There is the instant, then the hours, then the days, then the years. This is one reason nuclear weapons are fundamentally different from many conventional weapons. Their effects can continue long after the flash has disappeared. You look back toward Hiroshima. 3 days earlier, the city experienced the first atomic bombing in history. Now Nagasaki has experienced the second. 2 cities, 2 bombs, 2 mornings, and an entire world suddenly wondering whether this is the beginning of something much larger. But the war is finally approaching its final decision. Japan's leadership can no longer ignore the combined pressure. The emperor will soon intervene in the political crisis. The country is moving toward surrender. And for millions of people, that surrender will mean something they have not experienced for years. Silence, not the silence of destruction, the silence of a war ending. The war is still moving, but now it feels as though it is running out of road. You are in August 1945, and Japan's leaders are facing a situation that has become almost impossible to sustain. Hiroshima has been destroyed. Nagasaki has been struck. The Soviet Union has entered the war. American forces continue advancing across the Pacific. Japan's cities have suffered enormous destruction from conventional bombing, and the possibility of an Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands remains very real. For years, the Japanese government has been fighting with the expectation that surrender would be disastrous. Now the question becomes whether continuing the war would be even worse. Inside the government, there is disagreement. Some leaders want to accept surrender. Others resist. The issue is not simply whether Japan should stop fighting. There are questions about the emperor, the military, the future of the government, and what kind of terms the Allies will impose. You might imagine a simple room where everyone sits down and agrees that the war is over. It is not that simple. Political decisions during wartime rarely arrive neatly packaged. They come with arguments, fears, uncertainty, and people trying to predict consequences they cannot actually see. And while those arguments continue, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are living with the immediate consequences. For them, the war has already changed from something happening somewhere else to something that has physically erased their neighborhoods. But in Tokyo, leaders are thinking about the future of the entire country. The Soviet declaration of war is particularly important. Japan had hoped, in some circles, that the Soviet Union might help negotiate an end to the conflict. That possibility disappears when the Soviet Union attacks Japanese forces in Manchuria. The strategic situation becomes dramatically worse. Japan is no longer facing only the United States and its allies. Now the Soviet Union is moving against Japanese-held territory as well. Historians still argue over exactly how much this Soviet intervention influenced the final decision to surrender compared with the atomic bombings. The debate is not simply about which event happened first or which looked more frightening. It concerns what Japanese leaders believed about the future, how they interpreted military information, and which development finally convinced them that continuing the war was impossible. You can imagine the pressure inside the Japanese leadership. Hiroshima was destroyed by a single bomb. Then Nagasaki suffered another atomic attack. If the United States possesses more such weapons, what happens next? Could Tokyo be targeted? Could other cities disappear? Could Japan survive? These questions are impossible to answer with certainty, and uncertainty can be terrifying. The Japanese government also has to consider the possibility of invasion. American planners have prepared for a massive campaign against the Japanese home islands. If Japan does not surrender, such an invasion could produce enormous casualties on all sides. The Japanese military has also prepared for resistance. Civilians are expected to contribute to national defense. The prospect is grim, so when the emperor becomes involved, the decision takes on historic importance. Emperor Hirohito supports accepting the Allied terms under conditions that preserve the imperial institution. The government moves toward surrender, but even then, the story is not completely finished. Some military officer refuse to accept the decision. A group of officers attempts to prevent the surrender announcement from being broadcast. The event becomes known as the Kyujo incident. You can almost feel the tension. Japan is trying to end the war, yet some members of the military are still prepared to resist the decision. The surrender is not merely a statement, it is a political struggle. The emperor's recorded message is prepared for broadcast. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the voice they hear is unlike anything most have ever experienced. The emperor rarely speaks directly to the public. Now his voice is being used to announce the end of the war. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito's broadcast is heard across Japan. The language is formal. It is not the simple sentence you might expect. There is no casual, the war is over. Instead, the emperor speaks in highly formal language, explaining that Japan has decided to accept the Allied terms. Many listeners struggle to understand exactly what they are hearing. The broadcast uses an elevated form of Japanese. The sound quality is imperfect. For some people, it is the first time they have ever heard the emperor's voice. And slowly, the meaning becomes clear. The war is ending. After years of fighting, Japan is surrendering. You can imagine what that moment feels like. Relief, shock, confusion, sadness, disbelief. For some people, there is simply silence. They have spent years living according to wartime expectations. Now those expectations have suddenly disappeared. Soldiers who have been told to fight must consider what surrender means. Families who have lost relatives must confront the reality that those losses cannot be undone. Cities that have been destroyed face an enormous reconstruction problem, and Hiroshima remains at the center of the world's attention. But the end of the war does not immediately create peace in the emotional sense. The physical war is ending. The consequences are continuing. In Hiroshima, people are still injured. People are still sick. People are still searching for relatives. People are still living among ruins. The surrender does not rebuild the city overnight. It does not erase the memories of August 6. It does not explain every mysterious illness. It does not answer every moral question. Instead, it creates the possibility of beginning again. That beginning will be incredibly difficult. You walk through Hiroshima after the announcement. The city is quiet in places. People are trying to understand what comes next. There are no grand celebrations in the ruins. There is simply the strange realization that the war that shaped almost every part of daily life has ended. And now another kind of struggle begins. Reconstruction, recovery, remembering. The United States and its allies will occupy Japan. Military authorities will begin organizing relief and administration. The Japanese government will face enormous political changes. The country will eventually rebuild its economy and cities. But Hiroshima will carry a special burden. It is now known around the world as the first city to experience an atomic bombing. That identity will shape how the city rebuilds itself. The ruins will become evidence. Survivors will become witnesses. Scientists will study the effects. Governments will debate the weapon. And generations that were not alive in 1945 will eventually learn the story through photographs, testimony, museums, memorials, and history books. Yet beneath all of those future developments is one simple fact. The war has ended. You have reached the moment when the guns begin to fall silent. But Hiroshima's story is not ending with the surrender. In many ways, it is only becoming more complicated. Because now the question is no longer simply what happened on August 6th. The question is what happens to a city after surviving something that the world has never seen before. And that question will follow Hiroshima for decades. The war is over, but Hiroshima does not suddenly become peaceful. There is no magical morning when the ruins disappear and the streets return to normal. Instead, you wake to the much slower reality of recovery. The fighting has stopped. The airplanes are no longer coming to destroy the city. The surrender has been announced, but Hiroshima is still damaged. Thousands of people are still missing or displaced, and many survivors are dealing with illnesses whose causes they do not fully understand. You begin walking through the city again. The ruins are everywhere. Some areas are almost completely destroyed. Other structures have survived in damaged form. A few buildings remain standing in the middle of wide areas of destruction, looking strangely isolated. These surviving structures become landmarks. People use them to understand where they are. The city has to rebuild itself around fragments of what existed before. And reconstruction is not simply a matter of putting roofs back onto houses. There are enormous practical problems. Where will people live? Where will food come from? How will transportation work? How will hospitals operate? Where will schools reopen? How will businesses function? How will families locate missing relatives? And perhaps most importantly, how do you rebuild a city when so many of the people who would normally rebuild it are gone? Hiroshima's population has been devastated. The exact number of deaths is difficult to establish because records were destroyed. People died at different times, and many individuals were never formally identified. But tens of thousands died on the day of the bombing, and the death toll continued to rise after. That means the city is not simply rebuilding buildings. It is rebuilding a society with enormous gaps in families, workplaces, schools, and communities. You might pass a street where a house once stood. Now there is only open ground. You might remember that a shop used to be there. It is gone. A school may have survived partially, but teachers and students are missing. A hospital may be functioning again, but its staff have been reduced and its supplies are limited. Everything is incomplete. And then there is the invisible problem, radiation. At first, many people do not understand what it is doing. Some survivors who appeared relatively well after the bombing later became seriously ill. They may experience weakness, fever, bleeding, or other symptoms associated with radiation exposure. Doctors and researchers begin trying to understand these patterns. The medical community has studied radiation before, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki provide an unprecedented human context for understanding the effects of a nuclear explosion. Scientists begin collecting information: blood counts, medical histories, physical symptoms, exposure estimates, location data, survivor accounts. The tragedy becomes the basis for some of the earliest large-scale studies of radiation effect in human population. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this. The people being studied are not abstract laboratory subjects. They are survivors. They have names, families, memories, and lives that continue after the explosion. Yet their experiences provide information that scientists believe is essential for understanding radiation and protecting future generations. Historians still argue about the relationship between scientific research, medical assistance, and the politics of the post-war occupation, especially concerning how information about radiation effects was collected and communicated. The debate matters because knowledge is never completely separate from power. Who controls the records? Who decides what is published? Who decides what remains classified? Who gets access to medical information? These questions become increasingly important in the years after Hiroshima. You continue through the rebuilding city. People begin clearing debris. Roads are repaired. Buildings are reconstructed. Transportation gradually returns. Businesses reopen. Schools begin functioning again. Life is stubborn. It keeps returning. Children eventually laugh in places where buildings once collapsed. People open shops. Families plant things. Workers return to jobs. New houses appear. The city begins to look less like the place you saw immediately after the bombing. This transformation is remarkable. Within a few years, Hiroshima is visibly rebuilding. But reconstruction does not mean forgetting. The memory of August 6 becomes part of the city's identity. One of the most important places in that memory is the area around the hypocenter, the location directly beneath the point where the bomb detonated. Over time, memorial spaces are created. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park becomes a central location for remembrance. The atomic bomb dome, one of the few structures left standing near the hypocenter, becomes an especially powerful symbol. Its damaged framework remains visible against the changing city. You might stand there decades later and see something strange. A modern city surrounding an old ruin. New buildings, new roads, new businesses, people carrying phones and shopping bags, cars moving through streets, and then this surviving structure, reminding everyone that the landscape beneath the modern city has another layer. The past is still there. The atomic bomb dome eventually becomes one of the world's most recognizable symbols of nuclear destruction and peace. But immediately after the bombing, nobody knows what its future will be. It is simply one damaged building among many. Its meaning grows over time. That is how memorials often work. They do not always begin with a predetermined message. People assign meaning to them through memory. Hiroshima's reconstruction also becomes part of Japan's broader post-war transformation. The country experiences enormous political, economic, and social changes. Japan moves from wartime militarism toward a new political system. The economy eventually begins to recover. Cities modernize. New generations grow up who never experienced the war directly, and Hiroshima becomes increasingly associated with peace. This does not mean the city's history becomes simple. It remains a place with difficult questions. What should be remembered? How should the bombing be described? How should Japanese wartime aggression in Asia be discussed alongside the suffering of Hiroshima? How should victims, perpetrators, civilians, soldiers, and political leaders be represented? Historians and educators continue debating these questions. The memory of Hiroshima is never completely detached from the larger history of the Second World War. You walk farther into the rebuilt city. The rivers still flow. The mountains remain. The streets are fuller again. Children are growing up. The city is alive. That might be the most unexpected part of the story. Hiroshima does not remain frozen in August 1945. It changes. It expands. It becomes modern. And yet beneath that modern surface, the memory of the bombing remains. Every August 6, the city pauses to remember. Names are read. Memorial ceremonies are held. Families gather. Messages of peace are spoken. The date becomes a ritual, not because the city wants to live permanently in the past, but because forgetting what happened would make the future harder to understand. You look around at the rebuilt Hiroshima. The destruction is no longer obvious everywhere. A visitor unfamiliar with the history might simply see a modern Japanese city. But you know what happened here. You know that beneath these streets are layers of memory. You know that families once searched these same roads. You know that the morning of August 6 changed the city in seconds. And you begin to understand that rebuilding a place does not erase its history. Sometimes rebuilding is the way a city carries that history forward. You stand in Hiroshima decades after the morning of August 6, 1945, and the city around you looks almost impossible to connect with the photographs of its destruction. There are modern buildings, busy roads, trees, bridges, schools, people going to work, children heading home. The rivers still move quietly through the city. If you did not know the history, you might never guess what happened here. But the memories have not disappeared. They have been carried by people. The survivors of the atomic bombings are known as hibakusha, a Japanese term commonly used for people affected by the bombings. Their memories become one of the most important historical records of Hiroshima, because official documents can tell you when the bomb was dropped. Military records can tell you the aircraft involved. Scientists can explain nuclear fission. Maps can show the blast area. Statistics can estimate casualties. But none of those things can fully reproduce what it felt like to stand in Hiroshima that morning. For that, you need testimony. You need voices. You need people describing what they remember. And those memories are often remarkably ordinary. A person remembers where they were standing. Someone remembers what they were carrying. Someone remembers seeing a flash. Someone remembers being thrown down. Someone remembers searching for a parent. Someone remembers walking toward a river. Someone remembers the strange rain. These details might seem small compared with the scale of the bombing, but they are precisely what makes history human. You listen to these stories, and the huge event becomes personal. The atomic bomb stops being merely a weapon measured in kilotons. It becomes something experienced by individual people. A morning, a street, a family, a school, a workplace, a name. That is why survivor testimony becomes so important. Many hibakusha spend decades speaking about what happened. Some speak publicly. Some write memoirs. Some share memories with students. Others choose not to speak for many years. Trauma does not follow a schedule. There is no universal rule saying that someone should immediately be ready to describe a catastrophe. For some survivors, memories are painful. For others, speaking becomes a way to make sure younger generations understand what happened. And as the years pass, another urgency appears. People grow older. The number of living eyewitnesses decreases. A person who was a child in 1945 eventually becomes an elderly person. A person who was a young worker becomes a grandparent. A person who once walked through the ruins eventually becomes one of the few people left who can describe them from personal experience. The passing of generations, therefore, changes the way Hiroshima is remembered. The city begins preserving testimony more deliberately. Museums collect photographs, documents, objects, drawings, recordings, and personal accounts. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum becomes an important place for education and remembrance. Inside, visitors encounter evidence of the bombing and stories connected to individual lives. Some objects are ordinary. That makes them powerful. A school item, a piece of clothing, a personal belonging, a photograph, an object damaged by the blast. These things connect the enormous historical event to everyday life. You begin to understand something uncomfortable. The atomic bomb did not destroy an abstract target. It destroyed a city. A city is made of ordinary things. Homes, schools, shops, hospitals, factories, temples, offices, parks, and people. The human meaning of Hiroshima is therefore impossible to separate from the ordinary. One quirky but deeply revealing detail from the history of the bombing is the existence of objects that survived in damaged form and were later preserved as physical evidence. A simple object can sometimes communicate more than a long explanation because you can look at it and imagine the person who used it before the morning of August 6. That is the power of historical artifacts. They hold a connection to someone who was there. You continue listening to survivor accounts. Some describe the initial flash. Others describe the blast. Some remember the sudden darkness. Some remember people calling for help. Others remember the strange silence that followed. And some remember being unable to understand what had happened. There is no single Hiroshima experience. The city contained hundreds of thousands of individual experiences. A person close to the center experienced the event differently from someone farther away. A person inside a building experienced it differently from someone outdoors. A child experienced it differently from an adult. A person who lost family members carried a different memory from someone whose relatives survived. This variety matters. Historians still argue about how survivor testimony should be interpreted alongside official records, because memory can change over time and human recollection is not a perfect recording device. But that does not make eyewitness testimony useless. Instead, historians compare different accounts, documents, physical evidence, and later research to build the most accurate understanding possible. You realize that remembering Hiroshima is not simply about preserving facts. It is about preserving perspective. A timeline tells you that the bomb exploded at 8:15 in the morning. A survivor can tell you what it meant for the morning to stop being ordinary. A map can show the blast radius. A survivor can tell you what it meant to walk through a neighborhood that no longer looked like home. A casualty estimate can show scale. A survivor can tell you what it meant to search for one person. These forms of history do different things, and Hiroshima needs all of them. You continue through the memorial spaces. Names are preserved. Stories are recorded. Photographs remain. The Peace Memorial Park becomes a place where visitors from around the world come to learn. Some come as tourists. Some come as students. Some come as diplomats. Some come because a family member was there. Others come simply because they want to understand. The city has transformed remembrance into part of its public identity. But remembrance also raises difficult questions. How do you remember the victims without simplifying the war? How do you talk about Hiroshima while acknowledging Japan's own wartime actions across Asia? How do you explain the decision to use the bomb without turning history into a simple argument between heroes and villains? These questions remain complicated. Hiroshima happened during a brutal global war. Millions had already died before August 1945. Japan had fought a long and destructive war across Asia and the Pacific. The United States and its allies had suffered enormous losses. The atomic bomb was created within that context. Understanding the context does not remove the human consequences, and remembering the consequences does not require forgetting the context. You can hold both at the same time. That is one of the challenges of mature historical memory. You continue listening. A survivor's voice may become quieter. The story may slow. The details may become more personal. And suddenly, the distance between 1945 and the present seems much smaller, because a person who remembers Hiroshima was once simply a child, a student, a worker, a parent, someone with plans, someone who expected tomorrow to look much like today. Then the sky flashed. Everything changed, and they had to carry that memory for the rest of their life. That is why the voices of Hibakusha matter. They remind you that history is not only made of dates and decisions, it is also made of people who wake up on an ordinary morning and discover that the world they knew no longer exists. You have now walked through the morning of August 6, followed the destruction of Hiroshima, watched the war move towards surrender, and listened to the people who carried those memories forward. And eventually, you arrive at the question that has followed Hiroshima for more than 80 years. Was the atomic bombing necessary? It sounds like a simple question. It is not. The debate begins almost immediately after the war, and it continues today because answering it requires you to imagine not only what happened, but what might have happened instead. That second part is much harder. History gives you the event that occurred. It does not give you a second version of August 1945, in which different decisions were made. So you have to examine possibilities. The first major argument supporting the bombing is straightforward. Japan had not surrendered after Hiroshima. The Japanese government remained divided. The military continued to resist surrender. The United States expected that an invasion of the Japanese home island could be extraordinarily costly. American planners had already prepared for such a campaign. The fighting on islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated how fiercely Japanese forces could resist. The Battle of Okinawa had produced enormous casualties, including many civilian deaths. From the American perspective, continuing conventional warfare could mean an even greater loss of life. The atomic bomb offered a way to deliver a devastating shock without launching the invasion. That is the basic argument. You can understand why American leaders found it attractive. But then comes the counterargument. Japan was already in an increasingly desperate position. Its cities had been devastated by conventional bombing. Its military situation was deteriorating. The Soviet Union was entering the war. The United States had demonstrated the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Critics argue that alternatives might have been available. Perhaps the United States could have demonstrated the weapon without dropping it on a city. Perhaps the surrender terms could have been adjusted. Perhaps more time could have been allowed for Japan to respond after Hiroshima. Perhaps Soviet entry into the war would have produced the necessary shock. Perhaps a combination of these developments could have ended the war without a second atomic bombing. You begin to see why the debate never settles easily. Every alternative comes with uncertainty. Would a demonstration have worked? Would Japanese leaders have surrendered? Would the military have accepted the decision? Would an invasion have become necessary? Would more conventional bombing have killed even more civilians? Would waiting have allowed Japan to continue fighting? There are no laboratory experiments for history. You cannot run August 1945 again with different settings. Historians therefore examine documents, military plans, political discussions, intelligence reports, diaries, memoirs, and later testimony, and they interpret them. Historians still argue about the relative importance of the atomic bombings and the Soviet declaration of war enforcing Japan to surrender. Some emphasize the unprecedented destructive power of the atomic bomb. Others argue that the Soviet entry into the war was strategically devastating because it eliminated Japan's hope of using Moscow as a mediator and opened another front against Japanese forces. Still others emphasize the combined effect. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion, the blockade, the destruction of Japanese cities, the possibility of invasion, the internal political struggle. All of these pressures were operating simultaneously. History does not always provide a single button that caused everything. Sometimes several pressures become overwhelming at the same time. You can also examine the debate from another angle. What did the people who ordered the bombing believe they were accomplishing? The United States wanted Japan to surrender quickly. The war had already killed enormous numbers of people across the world. American leaders feared the consequences of a prolonged conflict. The bomb was therefore understood by its supporters as a weapon capable of ending the war. But then you look at Hiroshima itself. The weapon was used over a populated city. The overwhelming majority of people affected were civilians, although Hiroshima also contained military personnel and installations. That reality creates a moral question that cannot simply be answered by military calculations. Can the destruction of a city be justified if it ends a war sooner? What if it prevents an invasion? What if it also kills civilians? What if there are alternatives? What if those alternatives might fail? These questions have no universally accepted answer, and that is why Hiroshima remains such an important subject in history classes, universities, museums, military studies, political debates, and peace movements. The controversy is not only about what happened in 1945, it is also about what the world should learn from it. You walk through the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and notice how differently the city presents the story compared with a military history textbook. The emphasis is often on human suffering, nuclear danger, and the need to prevent another atomic bombing. The city's identity as a symbol of peace grows after the war, but even that message exists within a larger historical context. Japan's wartime aggression cannot simply be erased from the story. Japan invaded and occupied territories across Asia. Millions of people in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific suffered under Japanese military expansion and occupation. The Second World War in Asia involved enormous violence long before Hiroshima. So when you study Hiroshima, you are not studying an isolated event. You are studying the final stage of a much larger war. That does not make the bombing less significant. It makes the context more complicated, and perhaps that complexity is exactly what you need, because simple historical stories are comfortable. This person was good. That person was evil. This decision was obviously correct. That decision was obviously wrong. Real history rarely behaves so politely. People make decisions with incomplete information. Governments respond to threats. Military planners calculate probabilities. Scientists create technologies without always knowing how future generations will use them. and civilians live with consequences they did not choose. Hiroshima sits at the intersection of all of these forces. There is also a second major question. What did Hiroshima teach the world about nuclear weapons? Before August 1945, nuclear weapons existed primarily as a secret scientific and military project. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their destructive potential was no longer theoretical. The world had witnessed it. The United States soon faced a new international reality. The Soviet Union developed its own atomic bomb in 1949. The nuclear arms race accelerated. Hydrogen bombs followed. Stockpiles grew. Governments developed strategies based on deterrence. Humanity entered an era in which the possibility of destroying entire cities became part of international politics. That is the long shadow of Hiroshima. The bomb used in 1945 was only the beginning. Modern nuclear arsenals eventually became vastly more powerful. Weapons could be delivered by aircraft, missiles, submarines, and other systems. The question was no longer simply whether one city could be destroyed. It became whether human civilization itself could survive a large nuclear war. You stand quietly and think about that. A weapon created during one war helped define the next several generations. The scientific breakthrough became a political reality. The political reality became a security strategy. The security strategy became an arms race. And the arms race became one of the defining features of the modern world. Yet Hiroshima also produced another legacy: the pursuit of nuclear disarmament, the growth of peace movements, international efforts to limit nuclear testing and proliferation, education about the consequences of nuclear warfare, the preservation of survivor testimony. The city became not only a symbol of destruction, but a warning that technology can move faster than wisdom, a warning that military decisions can have consequences lasting far beyond the battlefield, and perhaps most importantly, a warning that the people who experience war are rarely the people who make the decisions that begin it. You look back toward the morning, 8:15, a clear sky, a city beginning its day, a weapon falling through the air, one decision, one explosion, and then decades of argument. The debate continues because Hiroshima cannot be reduced to a single sentence. It is a military story, a political story, a scientific story, a moral story, and above all, a human story. You return to Hiroshima in the years after the war, and at first the transformation is difficult to believe. The city is rebuilding, not perfectly, not quickly, but steadily. Where there were ruins, new buildings appear. Where roads were blocked, streets are repaired. Where families once searched through debris, new neighborhoods begin to form. The rivers still run through the city, quietly ignoring the arguments of historians, politicians, scientists, and everyone else who has spent decades trying to understand what happened here. Hiroshima refuses to remain frozen in 1945. That becomes one of the most important parts of its story. You might expect a city defined by destruction to preserve itself as a permanent ruin. Instead, Hiroshima rebuilds, schools reopen, businesses return, transportation improves, homes are constructed, people begin raising families again. Children grow up in a city whose worst day happened before they were born. That creates a strange relationship with memory. For one generation, Hiroshima is something they experienced. For the next, it becomes something they heard about, then something they study, then something they visit. The city has to find a way to preserve the past without becoming trapped inside it. This is where memorialization becomes important. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park develops into one of the central places for remembering the bombing. It is not simply a park. It is a space designed around memory. You walk through it and notice monuments, memorials, trees, open spaces, and visitors from many countries. The atmosphere is different from an ordinary city park. People speak more quietly. Some stop for a long time. Some leave flowers. Some bow their heads. Some simply stand and look. The park creates a physical connection between modern Hiroshima and the destroyed city. Near the park stands the atomic bomb dome. Its skeletal remains become one of the most recognizable symbols of Hiroshima. The building had been used for exhibitions and commercial purposes before the bombing, and because it stood relatively close to the hypocenter, it suffered enormous damage while portions of its structure remained standing. After the war, there were debates about whether the ruins should be preserved or removed. You can understand both instincts. One says the structure is dangerous and painful. Rebuild the city. Move forward. The other says that removing it would erase an important physical witness. Keep it. Let future generations see what happened. Eventually, preservation wins. The atomic bomb dome remains. In 1996, it is designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now people from around the world visit it. You can stand beside the structure and see modern Hiroshima rising around it. That contrast is powerful. New city, old ruin, life continuing around memory. It almost feels like the city is saying two things at once. We survived, and remember why we should never forget. The transformation of Hiroshima into a symbol of peace is not accidental. Survivors, citizens, political leaders, educators, and peace organizations contribute to this identity. August 6 becomes a day of remembrance. Every year, ceremonies are held, names of victims are read. A moment of silence is observed. Messages calling for peace and nuclear disarmament are delivered. At 8:15 in the morning, the city remembers the exact moment when everything changed. The ritual is simple, but repetition gives it strength. 1 year becomes 10, 10 becomes 20, 20 becomes 50. Eventually, the ceremony becomes part of the city's rhythm, and the date becomes known around the world. There is something remarkable about this. The same city that was once chosen as a military target becomes internationally associated with peace. The same place that demonstrated the destructive power of nuclear weapons becomes one of the world's strongest advocates for preventing their use. That transformation does not erase the past, it reinterprets it. Historians still argue about how much of Hiroshima's post-war identity was shaped by local activism, Japanese national memory, international politics, and the global nuclear disarmament movement. The city's peace identity developed through many influences rather than one single decision. You continue through the modern city. The streets are busy, trams move through neighborhoods, students walk to school, restaurants serve customers, businesses operate, tourists arrive, people take photographs. The ordinary has returned, and perhaps that is the most striking memorial of all life. A city cannot spend forever staring backward. People need jobs, children need schools, families need homes, businesses need customers, the future needs space. So Hiroshima builds that future, but it keeps certain places open for memory. This balance becomes part of the city's character. You can enjoy a meal here, you can cross a bridge, you can visit a museum, you can walk through a park, and at the same time, you can remember that the same ground once looked completely different. There is a curious detail about Hiroshima's transformation that sometimes surprises visitors. The city's modern landscape can make the destruction of 1945 difficult to imagine without photographs, maps, or preserved structures. The rebuilt city is so alive that the past can almost become invisible. That is why memory requires effort. If the physical landscape changes, people need stories. If the eyewitnesses disappear, people need archives. If the ruins are removed, people need photographs. If the children who experience the bombing grow old, younger generations need to listen. Memory does not automatically survive. It has to be carried. That is why the voices of Hibakusha become so important. They provide a bridge between the physical past and the modern city. You might hear a survivor speaking to a classroom. The students listen. Some are serious. Some are nervous. Some may struggle to imagine the event. That is normal. The bombing happened so long ago that it can feel like ancient history, but the person standing in front of them was there. Suddenly 1945 is not ancient. It is one human lifetime away. The survivor may explain what the city looked like, what people were doing, what happened afterward, what they remember. And then the students carry those memories forward. That process repeats. One generation tells another. The story moves. The details remain. Hiroshima's international role grows as well. World leaders visit. Peace organizations gather. Students from different countries learn about nuclear weapons. The city becomes part of global conversations about war and peace. Sometimes those conversations are political. Sometimes they are deeply personal. But Hiroshima remains the reference point. When people discuss nuclear weapons, they often return here. Not because Hiroshima was the only city destroyed during the Second World War. It was not. Many cities experienced devastating conventional bombing. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki represent something different. They mark the first wartime use of nuclear weapons. They show what happens when scientific knowledge becomes a weapon capable of transforming a city in seconds. And they remind the world that nuclear technology is not only about physics, it is about choices. What should be built? What should be used? Who decides? Who suffers? What should future generations remember? You stand once again beside the river. The water moves beneath the bridge. The city glows in the evening. People walk past you. Someone laughs. A bicycle passes. A train moves in the distance. It is almost impossible to imagine the silence and confusion of August 6 from this peaceful modern street. But the memory is still there, not shouting, not demanding that the city remain a ruin, simply waiting for someone to stop and listen. You return to Hiroshima one last time, but now the city is quiet, not the frightening quiet of August 6, 1945, not the silence of buildings after the blast. This is a different kind of quiet, a peaceful one. The rivers move gently through the city. Trees shift in the evening breeze. Trams pass through the streets. People walk home after work. Students talk with friends. Restaurant lights begin to glow, and somewhere nearby, someone is probably deciding what to have for dinner. Ordinary life. That is what Hiroshima has become again. And perhaps that is the most remarkable ending this story could have. Because the city did not disappear into history. It survived history. You can still walk the streets. You can still cross the bridges. You can still hear the sounds of everyday life. The city that once became a symbol of destruction has become a symbol of survival and peace. But if you slow down, you can still feel the presence of the past. It is in the memorials. It is in the museums. It is in the names. It is in the stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. It is in the testimony of people who were there. And it is in one particular time, 8:15 in the morning. That time remains permanently connected to Hiroshima. The clock seems almost frozen there. For a brief moment, you can imagine the city before the flash. The morning sun, the summer heat, the streets, the rivers, the workers, the students, the families, the people who had plans for later that day. Then the sky changes, and everything that follows becomes history. You have spent this journey, moving through that history from the inside. You watched Hiroshima waking up. You saw the city living through wartime uncertainty. You followed the final minutes before the bomb. You experienced the sudden transformation of the landscape. You moved through the confusion afterward. You encountered the black rain. You followed survivors searching for people they loved. You watched the news spread beyond Japan. You saw the second atomic bombing at Nagasaki. You followed Japan toward surrender. And then you watched Hiroshima rebuild itself. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that Hiroshima was not simply the place where an atomic bomb exploded. It was a city before the bombing. It was a city during the bombing, and it remained a city afterward. That sounds obvious, but history can sometimes flatten places into single moments. Pompeii becomes the volcano. Titanic becomes the sinking. Hiroshima becomes the bomb. Yet every place is more complicated than its most famous tragedy. Before August 6, Hiroshima had neighborhoods, schools, businesses, families, traditions, jokes, arguments, celebrations, and ordinary mornings. After August 6, those things did not simply vanish forever. Some disappeared, some were rebuilt, some were remembered, some changed, and some continued. That continuity matters. You can look at a modern photograph of Hiroshima and see a thriving city. You can look at an old photograph and see a completely different landscape. Both photographs are Hiroshima. The city contains both versions. This is why remembrance is not the same as living in the past. Remembering can be an act of looking forward. The people who preserve the history of Hiroshima are not simply saying, "Look what happened." They are also asking, what do you do with this knowledge? That question belongs to every generation, and perhaps it becomes more important as time passes. The people who experienced August 6 directly are becoming fewer. Eventually, there will be no living eyewitnesses left. The day will become something entirely carried through recorded testimony, photographs, documents, objects, memorials, and stories. That transition is inevitable, but it does not mean the memory has to disappear. History survives when people choose to carry it. Historians still argue about the bombing's military necessity, the alternatives that might have been available, and the relative importance of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet entry into the war. Those debates are unlikely to vanish, and perhaps they should not. A complicated event deserves serious questions. But there is something beneath the debate that does not require an argument. People suffered, families were separated, a city was devastated, and the world entered the nuclear age. Those facts remain. You stand quietly near the river. The water reflects the lights of the modern city. The same rivers were here in 1945. They witnessed the morning. They witnessed the smoke. They carried people searching for relief, and they continued flowing after the city began to rebuild. There is something strangely comforting about that. The world changes. Rivers continue. Seasons return, trees grow, children become adults, cities rebuild, memories move from one generation to another, and time keeps going. Perhaps that is why Hiroshima's story is ultimately not only about destruction, it is also about endurance. The city does not pretend that August 6 never happened. It does not hide the ruins. It does not erase the names. Instead, it carries the memory while continuing to live. That balance is difficult, but it is possible. And as the evening deepens, the noise of the modern city begins to soften. The streets are still active, but the pace feels slower. The lights reflect across the water. A breeze moves through the trees. You imagine the city settling into another night. No sirens, no aircraft, no explosions, just the ordinary sounds of people living. And perhaps, after everything you have heard tonight, that ordinary sound feels different. A bicycle passing, a distant train, a door closing, someone laughing, a quiet conversation. These are not insignificant sounds. They are evidence that life continues. Hiroshima's most powerful answer to destruction may simply be that it remained alive. The sky that once flashed white now darkens naturally with sunset. The rivers turn almost black beneath the evening light. The buildings glow softly. The memorial spaces become quieter. And the story that began with a clear summer morning slowly returns to silence. So before you let your attention drift away, remember the image we started with. A city waking up, people beginning an ordinary Monday, nobody knowing what was coming. That is how history often feels from the inside. You rarely know that you are standing at the edge of something enormous. You simply live. You make breakfast. You go to work. You walk to school. You talk to someone you love. You make plans for later, and then history happens. Hiroshima reminds you how fragile ordinary life can be, but it also reminds you how resilient ordinary life can become. The buildings can be rebuilt, the streets can be repaired, the trees can grow again, children can return to school, families can create new memories, and a city can choose to transform its deepest wound into a message for the future. That is where we leave Hiroshima tonight, not with the flash, not with the destruction, but with the quiet city that came afterward. The rivers continue moving, the lights remain on, and the morning of August 6, 1945, slowly becomes another distant point in human memory. Now let the pace slow. There is nothing more you need to understand tonight. The story can rest here. Imagine Hiroshima beneath a quiet evening sky, the streets gently illuminated, the rivers moving without hurry, carrying reflections of lights through the darkness. The city is no longer waiting for an explosion. It is simply living. Somewhere a window closes. Somewhere footsteps fade along a sidewalk. A distant train moves through the night. The trees stir softly in the breeze, and the memorial spaces remain quiet, holding memories that have traveled across generations. You can let those images become softer now. The photographs can fade. The voices can grow distant. The dates can settle gently into the background. There is no need to carry every detail with you. Just remember the simplest thing. Before history becomes history, it is ordinary life. People wake up, people work, people laugh, people make plans, and afterward, if they are fortunate, people rebuild. Hiroshima rebuilt. The city continues. The rivers continue. The seasons continue. Morning will eventually come again, as it always does. For now, though, you can let the lights of the city blur into the darkness. Let the quiet water move beneath the bridges. Let the distant sounds become softer. Let your breathing settle into a comfortable rhythm. The story is finished. The night is calm, and for a little while, you do not have to go anywhere. Just rest. Let the history drift away like a distant sound beyond the window. The city remains peaceful. The sky is dark. The rivers keep moving, and the night grows quiet. Knowledge. The failure to achieve perfect mind control does not erase the ethical problem. In fact, it makes one aspect of the story even stranger. Imagine spending enormous effort trying to discover a technology